While the Ukrainian and Russian delegations were holding the first round of talks in Abu Dhabi on ending Russia's war against Ukraine, much more important negotiations took place, though not as publicly or loudly. The leaders of the United States, China and Russia, Trump, Xi Jinping and Putin, held parallel talks where they discussed Russia's war against Ukraine, Donald Trump's peace council, the situation in Iran, as well as issues of trade and sanctions. Interestingly, Donald Trump is already offering China American and Venezuelan oil instead of Russian oil, and he hints that it's time to get rid of that old nag called Russia and decide the fate of the world together. But Xi Jinping still suggests to Vladimir Putin to strengthen military cooperation. But what matters for us is that against the backdrop of such negotiations between the three leaders, a statement suddenly appears that the talks in Abu Dhabi could bring an unexpected breakthrough. So what did Trump, Putin and Xi Jinping discuss and what was left behind the scenes? Let's talk about all of this in this episode, and I'll give you a spoiler right away. American intelligence has stated that Xi Jinping has developed serious paranoia. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give it a like and leave any comment under this video. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel Pichi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There you will also find links to platforms and details that you can use to support the work of this YouTube channel with your donation or paid subscription. I appreciate any support you give. So, today, on February 4th, there were two key phone conversations. The leader of China, Xi Jinping, spoke with the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and the American President Donald Trump. And these calls took place right at the time when Ukrainian, American and Russian delegations were holding two-day negotiations in Abu Dhabi about ending Russia's war against Ukraine. Today was the first day, tomorrow is the second. News first broke that China's leader Xi Jinping had a video call with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin on February 4th. The conversation occurred during today's Ukraine-Russia negotiations in Abu Dhabi, first reported by the South China Morning Post. It is noted that this was the first conversation between Putin and Xi Jinping this year, as both sides seek to strengthen strategic cooperation amid rising global geopolitical tensions. And so, according to the publication, Xi Jinping stated that the relationship between China and Russia is on the right track and that the two countries need a grand plan to develop their ties. Putin in turn told Xi Jinping that China-Russia relations are a stabilizing factor in times of global turbulence. Yuri Ushakov, an aide to the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, spoke about the closed part of the talks between Putin and Xi Jinping, which lasted an hour and a half. Putin and Xi Jinping discussed strengthening bilateral relations during their conversation. Please excuse the official language. They paid attention to international issues, agreed that consultations are needed between the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and defense agencies. The ministries would strengthen ties, agreed to intensify such professional dialogue, and noted that the strategic partnership is constructive and not directed against any third party. Xi Jinping invited Putin to visit China in the first half of the year. The Russian dictator, of course, accepted the invitation and agreed. And during the discussion of global issues, they noted bilateral contacts and exchanged views on the relations between Russia and China. With the United States of America and the initiative of American President Donald Trump to create a peace council, they compared their approaches regarding Venezuela and Cuba. Ushakov also said Xi Jinping backs Russia-Ukraine talks in Abu Dhabi. Vladimir Putin, in turn, shared the latest developments regarding the settlement of Russia's war against Ukraine. In short, I think these last points were key. Xi Jinping and Putin discussed exactly the options for ending Russia's war against Ukraine and how Russians should behave in these negotiations, as well as what Russia can expect in terms of support from China. Let me remind you that China officially positions itself as supposedly neutral in Russia's war against Ukraine. At the same time, Beijing continues close cooperation with Moscow, and some Chinese companies supply Russia with dual-use goods that can be used for weapons production. Let me remind you, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky recently said China has not shown willingness to help settle the war peacefully. And according to him, Beijing's policy is actually strengthening Russia's financial ability to continue its aggression. China has become the main supplier for Russia's military machine and could have been transferring lethal weapons to Moscow. In addition, some media have already reported that China is sending Russia specialized machines, tools, and high-tech equipment that are used to create hypersonic missiles with nuclear warheads, including the Oreshnik missile. In other words, there could be no Oreshnik without Chinese technology and machines. Interestingly, Moscow has now truly become a vassal of China. You know, in Muscovy, they really loved using words like suzerain and vassal. They used to say that Ukraine was a vassal and the United States was the suzerain. Dmitry Medvedev especially liked to use these definitions, but it turns out that Moscow is actually a vassal of Beijing. And this is evident even in the tone of the conversation between Xi Jinping and Putin. For example, here's what Russian propaganda writes today, quote, Vladimir Putin, during a video conference with Chairman Xi Jinping of the People's Republic of China, reported on the widespread adoption and celebration of the Chinese New Year in Russia. He reported to the Chinese leader that, as part of the years of Russian and Chinese culture, more than 400 events were held, which sparked genuine interest among the citizens of both countries. Of course, we are not stopping there. Soon, Chinese New Year will again be widely celebrated in Moscow and other Russian cities. This has become a good tradition for us, noted Vladimir Putin. He also pointed out the symbolic nature of the date of communication with Xi Jinping, emphasizing that he is glad to continue the tradition of personal contact at the start of the Chinese New Year, especially on such a symbolic day according to the Chinese lunar calendar. Today is the beginning of spring, Lichun, after which the frosts leave, renewal comes, and a new cycle in nature begins, said Vladimir Putin. Well, sorry, I got a bit distracted here. It's important to note this immediately after. After taking care of Xi Jinping's fifth point, Xi Jinping called the American president, Donald Trump. The Chinese side did not provide details of the conversation. But Trump wrote such a huge post about this. Here's a quote from Donald Trump. I just had a great phone conversation with the president of China, Xi Jinping. It was a long and thorough conversation during which we discussed many important topics, including trade, military affairs, and my upcoming trip to China in April. Taiwan, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the current situation with Iran. China's purchase of oil and gas from the United States, China's consideration of buying additional agricultural products, including increasing soybean volumes to 20 million tons this season, and they committed to purchasing 25 million tons next season, supplies of aircraft engines, and many other topics. All very positive relations with China, with China. The relations are extremely good, and we both understand how important this responsibility is. And I believe that in the next 3 years of my presidency, many positive results will be achieved in cooperation with President Xi Jinping and the People's Republic of China. I should note right away that Donald Trump calls Xi Jinping president. It sounds strange, but that's what he calls him. But American intelligence doesn't seem to be very happy about this kind of contact. United States intelligence assessments say Xi Jinping has recently suffered from extreme paranoia. In late January, he dismissed 2 top generals for corruption, including Colonel General Zhang Yuxia, the armed forces' second-in-command. As a result of large-scale purges in the People's Liberation Army of China, this army was left virtually without top leadership. There is no obvious reason behind these actions of Xi Jinping. Therefore, according to intelligence, they can be explained either by paranoia, an attempt to protect himself from political rivals, or by a genuine desire to put an end to corruption in the army. I'll now quote the New York Times on this. Enemies are everywhere. This is a typical worldview of a dictator. Moreover, such a person considers those closest to him to be the greatest threat to his power, not opposition members or dissidents. Since World War II, 23% of rulers have been exiled, imprisoned, or killed, but for dictators, this figure is 69%. As an autocrat, you have to be paranoid. You're constantly at risk. Everyone around you is always deceiving you, and you never know who is truly loyal and who is lying to you. In such systems, purges of the top military leadership are a common occurrence. Overall, in this regard, it will be interesting to see the results of the second day of negotiations taking place in Abu Dhabi, because it's clear that today some technical issues were discussed. I have a separate episode on today's Abu Dhabi negotiations results. Check it out. And these contacts between Xi Jinping, Trump and Putin clearly fit into this logic of negotiations to end Russia's war against Ukraine. So I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. And if you found this episode interesting and useful, you can support it with your donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye.